A quiet phone call after chemo, and everything I thought I knew unraveled. I never imagined that after 30 years of being the dutiful daughter, the dependable sister, and the kind of mother who never missed a recital or a fever, what would finally bring me to my knees wouldn't be the cancer, but a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes. That day, I had just stepped out of the oncology wing at Mercy Ridge Medical Center in Cincinnati. My arms still trembled from my 4th round of chemo. My skin felt paper-thin, and I was holding a plastic bag with anti-nausea meds I could barely afford. My phone rang just as I reached my car. It was my mother. Her voice was lighter than usual, almost careful, as though she were trying not to bruise something delicate. "Linda," she said, "we've been thinking about Thanksgiving this year, and we're going to keep it small. Just the adults. Quiet. You understand, right?" I froze next to the car door, barely able to process her words. My breath caught in my throat. "So no kids?" I asked slowly. There was a pause, just long enough to make something twist in my gut. "Well," she sighed, "we just thought the house would be calmer, you know? Ryan's kids will be there, of course. They're well-behaved, very mature for their age. But yours?" She trailed off. "They're just a little high energy." I stood motionless in the parking lot, the cold wind tugging at my scarf, which I had wrapped over the soft scalp I had begun to lose to the treatment. My children, Mia, 7, and Grant, 4, were not perfect, but they were joyful, loud with life, and they loved their grandparents in ways that only small children could, purely and without conditions. "They're just kids," I replied, my voice catching. "They're sweet, and they adore you." "We just want a peaceful evening," she said, her tone clipped now, like I was the one making a scene. "Don't take it personally." But how could I not? This wasn't just about a holiday dinner. It was about how they had always treated my children, like a disruption, a chore, a problem to be managed. It was the way they never showed up to Mia's dance recitals, the way Grant's birthday cards always arrived late, or not at all. And now they weren't even hiding it anymore. "I can't believe you're doing this," I whispered. "You're telling me Ryan's kids are welcome, but mine aren't?" "Don't be dramatic," she replied flatly. "It's just one night. You and Marcus are still invited." That was the moment everything fell into focus. They wanted me there, but not the 2 small people I loved more than anything in the world, and that said more than they probably realized. "No," I said, steadying my voice. "If my children aren't welcome, then neither am I." The line went quiet. Then, after a sharp sigh, she said, "Suit yourself," and hung up. I stood in the stillness of the parking lot, the phone slipping slowly from my hand. I could hear the faint buzz of the city around me, cars, distant sirens. But in my chest, there was only one sound, the breaking of an illusion I had held onto for far too long. I had spent a lifetime trying to earn their love. But now, recovering from a disease that had stolen so much from me, I realized this wasn't love. It was performance. And I was done performing. They had made their choice. And now, it was time I made mine. I don't know what hurt more, the disease quietly killing my body from the inside out, or hearing my own mother say, almost casually, that only Ryan's kids are a good fit for Thanksgiving this year. At first, I clung to the desperate hope that maybe she misspoke, or maybe she was stressed and didn't mean what she said. But no, this wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a choice, deliberate and unapologetic. Ryan, my younger brother, the one who left home for years chasing a woman twice his age, and came back with 2 children from a short-lived marriage, had always been the golden child. And I, Linda Harper, the eldest daughter, the caregiver, the one who stayed, the one who gave up her career to care for our aging parents, the one now battling cancer. I was somehow the inconvenience, the noise, the one who didn't fit the aesthetic of their picture-perfect family gathering. I remembered the last time we all sat together in that old living room in New Harmony, Indiana. My mum's wall was filled with pictures of Ryan's boys, framed, polished, on display. Meanwhile, photos of my children were tucked away near the old heater, half covered by a dusty ceramic angel. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe she just hadn't had time to rearrange the photos. But now I knew the truth. They weren't forgotten. They were intentionally hidden. When I asked, "So just my kids aren't invited? Ryan's still bringing his?" There was a pause long enough to punch a hole through my chest. Then she said, like she was explaining something to a slow child, "His boys are just calmer, more respectful. Your 2 are a little much. You know how loud they can be. We just want peace this year, Linda." I stood there, in my small kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, while my kids splashed soapy water behind me and giggled like the world was still kind. And for a moment, I wished they weren't so innocent. Because if they knew what their grandmother had just said, their little hearts would have broken right there. Same as mine. Since my diagnosis with stage 2 ovarian cancer, I had hoped this might be a turning point for our family, a time for healing, for forgiveness, for finally being seen. But my mother had just made it crystal clear. Even when I'm sick, even when I'm fighting for my life, I'm still not enough. And worse, neither are my children. And that, more than the chemo, more than the scars, more than the fear of dying, that was what truly shattered me. Because if I stayed silent, if I accepted this invitation with conditions, then Christmas would be next, and then birthdays. And slowly, my children would learn something I spent my whole life unlearning. That love in this family is earned, and it comes with terms and silence. Number I had been quiet for far too long. I had swallowed disappointment, blurred boundaries, and bit back truth for the sake of peace. But now, with death breathing down my neck and nothing left to lose, I wouldn't spend another second pretending that this was okay. The silence that followed our last conversation settled into my home like a slow fog, thick, cold, and unwelcome. I tried to shake it off, tried to lose myself in the mundane rhythm of daily life. But nothing seemed to drown out the echo of my mother's voice, reminding me, in so many carefully chosen words, that my children weren't good enough for her table. I should have expected what came next. A few days after that call, while I was curled up on the couch with a heating pad pressed to my aching stomach and my youngest asleep beside me, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my brother, Ryan. The message was short, but it carried the same arrogance that had followed him his entire life. "Heard you're being dramatic about Thanksgiving again. Mum said you're making it a bigger deal than it is." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the blood in my veins cooling like it had just turned to stone. I knew immediately she had run to him, playing the victim, twisting the story in the way only she could, so that I became the problem, the unreasonable one, the source of the tension she had sown herself. I typed back before I could second-guess myself. "Did she also tell you she invited your kids but told mine not to come?" The typing bubble popped up, disappeared, reappeared again, like even he couldn't come up with a lie fast enough to cover for her. When he finally responded, it was just more of the same. "She's just trying to have a peaceful dinner. You know how your kids can be a lot sometimes. A lot. That's what they called my children now. Not joyful, not spirited, just a lot. Like they were baggage to be managed, noise to be avoided, problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. And the worst part, this wasn't new. It was the same tired pattern that had played out over years: the missed birthdays, the forgotten school performances, the gifts that somehow always arrived a week late or were labelled with the wrong names. While Ryan's boys got video game consoles and sports tickets, I had ignored it, told myself I was imagining things, that being a single working mum going through chemo probably made me overly sensitive. But now, they had said it out loud. There was no hiding behind polite excuses or unspoken favoritism. They had drawn the line, and they had drawn it through my children. I put the phone down and sat in the darkened living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. My body felt hollow. It wasn't just betrayal, it was abandonment, served cold and without remorse. And yet, somehow, it wasn't the final blow. That came later. Just as I began to pull back, to take quiet steps away from the people who had raised me but no longer saw me, the phone rang again. It was Mom. I let it go to voicemail. Then again, and again. Finally, on the fourth call, I answered, not because I was ready to speak, but because some part of me still hoped they'd realized what they had done. "Linda," she said, voice sharp with irritation rather than concern, "I need to ask you something. Did you cancel your father's credit card?" The question hit me like a gust of wind in winter. Sharp, unexpected, and painfully cold. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice already narrowing to suspicion. "The card we use for groceries," she said. "For gas? Medications? It was declined this morning." At first I was confused. Then slowly, a dark realization began to uncoil inside me like smoke rising from a flame I hadn't noticed burning. Years ago, when Dad was recovering from knee surgery and money was tight, I had added them as authorized users on my credit card. Temporarily, I thought. It was meant to be a short-term fix while they caught their breath. But life had moved fast, and I had been too busy raising children, surviving cancer, and keeping my job at Clarion Manufacturing to even notice they were still on it, or that they had been quietly using it every month for years. And not once did they remind me. Not once did they ask if it was still okay. They just took. "You mean my credit card?" I said, barely able to keep the tremble from my voice. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she huffed, the words familiar, like poison sugar-coated in faux maternal concern. "You make good money. What's the harm in supporting your parents a little?" I could hardly breathe. I had spent years silently funding their lives while raising 2 children alone, juggling appointments and hospital visits, fighting cancer with a smile I forced every morning so my kids wouldn't know how scared I really was. And through it all, they had treated me like a burden, like I should be grateful just to be allowed to orbit their universe. But now I saw it clearly. It was never about family, it was about usefulness. I was a wallet with a pulse, a convenience wrapped in sacrifice. "Well," I said, voice like ice, "you can consider that card officially cancelled. And while we're being honest, don't expect another dime. No groceries, no prescriptions, no birthday gifts, nothing." She gasped, offended as if I had betrayed her, as if the theft of thousands of dollars over years could be justified by something as flimsy as, "You owe us because we raised you." But I was done owing anyone, especially them. When I ended that call with my mother, I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, in the deepest, most ancient places of my soul, but because something inside me had finally shifted, like a gear locking into place after years of slipping. I had spent decades as the dependable daughter, the default fixer, the one they called when the faucet leaked, or when their internet glitched, or when a grandchild needed to be picked up from school. But now that I was no longer useful, now that I had set a boundary, their warmth vanished like breath on a mirror. The next few days were strangely quiet. No texts, no calls. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but punitive. It didn't take long to realize they weren't done punishing me, not just for cutting off the credit card, but for daring to say no at all. By the end of the week, I had ignored 7 missed calls and 4 unread messages, most from my father and Ryan, with subjects ranging from "family doesn't do this to each other" to "you're overreacting again." The language was always familiar, carefully framed to make me feel guilty, as if protecting my children and my own sanity were sins rather than acts of love. And just when I thought the storm might pass, another text came through, this one from Ryan again. "Mom and Dad are upset you're ghosting them. They just want to talk. Are you really going to let this go on over one dinner?" It was stunning, really, how little they understood, or perhaps how little they cared to. This wasn't about one dinner. It never had been. This was about years of being second place, of being used, of watching my children treated like background noise while Ryan's boys were paraded like royalty. This was about every moment I bit my tongue when I should have spoken, every time I said, "It's okay," when it absolutely wasn't. Still, I typed a response. It went too far the moment they told me my kids weren't welcome. That's not family. That's exclusion dressed up as tradition. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned off my phone and dropped it into a drawer, where it sat untouched for the rest of the holiday week. Thanksgiving came, and for the first time in over 20 years, I didn't rush to pack a side dish or wrestle the kids into dress clothes they'd grow out of by Christmas. Instead, I made pancakes in our kitchen while my daughter, Mia, helped stir the batter with flour on her cheeks, and my son, Grant, perched on a stool beside me, carefully counting blueberries like he was guarding treasure. We didn't dress up, we didn't take pictures for approval, and we didn't make polite conversation while swallowing disappointment. Instead, we laughed, we flipped pancakes too high, and we ate in our pajamas at the table we loved. That morning, I realized something that would carry me through the long months ahead. Peace doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. But the world outside our little kitchen hadn't changed. The phone started ringing again, this time from unknown numbers and friends who said things like, "I heard you've been distant lately," or "Your mum's worried about you." I began to understand the shape of the isolation they were building around me, not just distance, but erasure. At the grocery store, an old family friend avoided eye contact. At the pharmacy, someone I barely knew asked, "Is everything okay with your parents?" As if I had committed some unspoken betrayal. The small town web they operated in was tightening, and the message was clear: play along, fall in line, or be cut out. But what they didn't realize, what they had never understood, was that I had already survived the worst. I had faced my own mortality, sat through endless nights with the taste of metal in my mouth from chemo, watched my hair collect in handfuls in the shower, and still gotten up the next morning to pack lunches and smile for my children. I had endured the silence of waiting rooms, the indignity of medical bills, and the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to stay hopeful when everything in your body wants to give up. So being ignored by people who only ever loved the version of me that served them? That wasn't devastation. That was freedom in disguise. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting, especially when the rejection came gift-wrapped in fake concern. A week after Thanksgiving, my father called again. I let it ring twice before answering. "Linda," he said, his voice overly calm, like he was talking to a customer service rep instead of his daughter. "We'd really like to move past this. Let bygones be bygones." I waited. He continued, "You and Marcus can still come to Christmas. Just maybe leave the kids with a sitter again, like before. Keep things quiet." And there it was. The lie behind the olive branch. The peace they offered was only ever conditional. I took a breath, steady and clear. "No," I said simply. "Not this time. Not ever again." The line went quiet. Then, in the softest, most cutting voice I'd ever heard from him, he said, "You'll regret this, Linda. One day, when we're gone." But I already regretted too many things. Biting my tongue, teaching my kids that being quiet kept you included, sacrificing dignity for the illusion of belonging. I wouldn't add this to the list. So I ended the call, walked into the living room where Mia and Grant were building a Lego castle that defied gravity, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled without force. Because I knew that the loneliness they tried to weaponize would never match the strength of the peace I had built for myself and the family I chose to protect. A revenge story told in first person, subtle, steady, and sharp. After that final call with my father, there was no explosion, no slammed doors or screaming matches, just a profound and irreversible stillness. And within that silence, I began to move. Not with rage, not with noise, but with a clarity sharpened by years of quiet humiliation. I didn't make dramatic declarations or post my grievances online. I simply stopped showing up, first to their needs, then to their wants, and eventually to their expectations. It started small, almost unnoticeable. When my father left a voicemail asking if I could come by and help set up his new TV, I let it ring into the void. When my mother texted to say she needed someone to pick up her prescription from Harriston Pharmacy, I never replied. These were tasks I had once rushed to fulfill, often while juggling chemo schedules and parent-teacher meetings. But now I left them unanswered, like forgotten invitations to a party I no longer wished to attend. At first, I told myself this distance was temporary. A pause, a cooling-off period, a boundary. But with every passing day, the silence stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like peace. I could finally breathe without checking if they were watching, judging, needing. And what struck me most wasn't how free I felt, but how fast they noticed. The week before Christmas, the calls came more frequently. I received a message from my mother that read, "Linda, I know you're upset, but can we move past this? Just you and Marcus. Leave the kids at home like we agreed. We'd really like to see you." There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just another invitation with fine print and conditions. I didn't respond, but they didn't give up. When guilt failed, they turned to fear. 2 days later, a package arrived, not at my house, but at Marcus's office. Inside was a thick envelope, neatly labelled with legal letterhead. When he brought it home, his face was pale. "It's from your parents," he said quietly, sliding it across the kitchen table. I opened it slowly, unsure whether to laugh or scream. It was a formal document, an itemized claim, as if I were a debtor, not a daughter. They were demanding reimbursement for decades of emotional and financial support, citing food, clothes, school supplies, and even things like summer camp and dental cleanings. The final total was just under $80,000. I held the paper between my fingers for a long time, stunned not by the amount, but by the audacity. They had spent years draining my resources, treating me like their backup plan, using my credit card to buy groceries and gas without ever asking if I could afford it. And now they had the nerve to frame my childhood as a debt I owed them. That night, as Marcus put the kids to bed and I sat alone in the dining room, I didn't cry. I felt something colder, steadier, resolve. They wanted control, not reconciliation. They wanted me back in their pocket, not in their hearts. And now, backed into a corner, they were throwing legal jargon like stones in glass houses. I waited until the next morning, drove to their house just after sunrise, the letter folded neatly in my coat pocket. My parents lived in the same brick bungalow on Hawthorne Street they'd had since I was a child. The house looked smaller now, though maybe it was just my perspective that had changed. My mother opened the door, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Linda," she said, cautiously optimistic. "We didn't expect—" I pulled the letter from my coat and held it up, not letting her finish. "This," I said calmly, "this is what you've become?" She crossed her arms, retreating into defensive posture. "It's only fair. You can't just cut us off and expect there to be no consequences." I laughed once, sharp and short, without warmth. "You mean the way you cut off my children? The way you dismissed me the moment I stopped serving your needs?" My father appeared in the hallway, his face stone cold. "We made sacrifices for you. We raised you. Now you turn your back on us?" I stepped forward, eyes locked on both of them. "No, Dad. You turned your backs the moment you made it clear that love in this house came with conditions. You taught me that silence earned approval and obedience bought affection. But I'm not that little girl anymore." They tried to interrupt, but I raised the paper one last time, then ripped it clean down the center. "This is done. I owe you nothing. And if you try to come after me again, legally or otherwise, I promise you, every voicemail, every text, every charge you made on my credit, I'll bring it all to court and let a judge decide who owes whom." My mother gasped like I had just slapped her, while my father's expression faltered for the first time. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, the wind biting at my cheeks, but the fire in my chest burning steady. I didn't need revenge through destruction. I just needed them to understand that I would no longer be their collateral. And that, perhaps, was the greatest retaliation of all. Not shouting, not bitterness, but freedom, claimed quietly and without permission. I had foolishly hoped that tearing up the letter would end it, that after years of quiet compliance followed by a final act of resistance, they would finally accept what I had, that whatever version of family we once had was gone, and that I had no intention of returning to the role of obedient daughter, personal technician, or unacknowledged financial lifeline. But people like my parents don't surrender control. They escalate. It started the week before New Year's, a time I had always considered sacred, a chance to shed the old and step into something new. For the first time in years, I had begun to feel something close to contentment. My hair had started to grow back, soft and fine around my temples, and the sharp edge of chemo fatigue had begun to dull. My children laughed more. I cooked without dread. I smiled without guilt. But peace for them was a threat. And on New Year's Eve, just as we were setting the snack table and arranging streamers for the countdown, there was a knock on the door that froze the room like a sudden storm. Through the peephole, I saw them. My mother, my father, Ryan, and his wife, all standing on my porch like a tribunal dressed in holiday coats. They weren't there to reconcile. I could see it in the way my father stood, arms crossed, jaw locked, and in the way my mother held her purse tight against her side, like it contained some moral high ground. I opened the door slowly, bracing myself. "We just want to talk," my mother began. Her voice dipped in sweetness so artificial it made my skin crawl. "We don't want this to go any further." I didn't respond, so my father stepped in, his voice lower but more pointed. "Linda, we know you're hurting, but this has gone too far, and we don't want the kids caught in the middle of this mess." I raised an eyebrow, already anticipating the twist. "And what does that mean?" "Exactly." Ryan cleared his throat and glanced at his wife, who nodded. "They've been speaking with an attorney," he said, his voice stiff with justification. "They're exploring grandparents' rights. If you won't let them see the kids, they'll take legal steps." For a moment, all I could hear was the buzz of my own pulse, like a warning bell in the back of my skull. Then I laughed, not out of amusement, but from the sheer absurdity. "You're serious," I said, eyes narrowing. "You're going to take me to court because I stopped letting you walk all over me." "We've done nothing wrong," my mother snapped, the sugary veneer gone in an instant. "This is about the children. They deserve to have a relationship with their real family." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me so my children wouldn't hear. "You mean the children you excluded from Thanksgiving? The ones you labeled as too loud, too much, not refined enough for your precious table?" I was shaking now, not from fear, but from the quiet fury that rises when someone tries to rewrite the story you've lived. My father straightened, but I met his stare without blinking. "You're welcome to go to court," I said. "But if you do, I will show the judge every message you ever sent me, every charge you made on my card, every instance where you treated my kids like second-class citizens. You really think that's going to look good on record?" They hadn't expected resistance. Not this kind. Not with documents and dates and a paper trail of exploitation. My mother's lips thinned, and Ryan's wife looked away. "I've spent my life being the peacekeeper," I continued. "I've swallowed insults, ignored favoritism, and financed your comfort out of guilt. But I will not let you use my children as leverage to reclaim control over me." There was a beat of silence, heavy with a tension I'd never been allowed to express growing up. And then, in a voice colder than the January air, my father said, "You're going to regret this, Linda. You don't get to erase your family." "No," I replied, stepping back inside, "but I get to choose who I let into mine." And with that, I shut the door, not in anger, but in liberation. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting from fear or guilt or even sorrow. I was simply done. They didn't file anything. Of course they didn't. They knew they had no legal ground, no moral case, no defense for what they'd done and how long they'd done it. Their silence in the following weeks was confirmation that their bluff had been called, and this time I didn't flinch. I had learned that some wars aren't won in courtrooms or family meetings, but in the quiet moments when you finally stop asking for permission to be treated with decency. And though I walked away without a ruling or a settlement, I walked away with something far more powerful: my voice, my peace, and the unshakable resolve to never trade them again for anyone's approval. I thought that standing firm, refusing to bow to their threats, and watching them back down would be the end. That finally, after months of guilt games, legal posturing, and veiled manipulation, they would leave me and my children alone. But I underestimated how deeply entitlement ran when someone had grown used to taking without being questioned. The silence, though welcome at first, didn't last long. Just before Christmas, they tried again, this time dressed in ribbons and plastic smiles. I had just finished hanging the last ornament on the tree, and Mia and Grant were still in their pajamas, dancing to old Bing Crosby songs, while Marcus brewed hot cocoa in the kitchen. Everything about that moment felt soft, safe, and real, until the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, I saw them, my parents, standing on the porch with a massive, perfectly wrapped gift. I opened the door only halfway, not out of malice, but protection. My mother's face lit up, falsely sweet. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," she chirped, lifting the box. "This is for the kids." I didn't reach for it. I didn't even step aside. "You can keep it," I said, not unkindly, but firmly. "We're doing Christmas differently this year." She blinked, caught off guard. "Linda, don't be stubborn. Let's not ruin the holiday over one misunderstanding." But it wasn't one misunderstanding. It was years of being second best, of watching my kids get sidelined, of hearing them ask why Nana never came to their school shows or why Papa always left early. It was betrayal, not just once, but over and over again, disguised as tradition and excused with phrases like, "You're too sensitive," or "Ryan's boys are just easier." And it was the final straw, when they had looked me in the eye and told me my children weren't welcome, not even as I stood recovering from chemo, barely able to keep food down, still trying to be someone worth loving. "You already ruined Christmas," I replied, voice low and steady. "When you told me that my kids weren't good enough for your table, that was the moment something broke. And I'm not going to tape it back together just because you showed up with wrapping paper." My father, who had been silent until then, stepped forward. "Let's just be a family again, Linda. Enough of this." But I'd heard that line before. Every time I tried to set a boundary, every time I asked for respect. And I knew now that what they meant by family was a system where I kept giving, kept forgiving, kept sacrificing, while they never once examined the damage they caused. I shook my head. "You don't want to be a family. You want me to go back to being useful." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. My mother's expression hardened. "Think about the children. Don't be selfish." That word, selfish, had been their favorite weapon, wielded every time I said no. But this time, I smiled, not bitterly, but with peace. "I am thinking about the children. That's exactly why you're not in their lives anymore." They stood there for a long second, waiting for me to change my mind, to crack, to soften like I always had. But I didn't. And when I closed the door, it wasn't with anger. It was with finality. That night, Mia and Grant tore open their presents with joy in their eyes, their laughter echoing through the house as if the walls themselves had been waiting for this kind of peace. We played board games, watched old movies, and fell asleep in the living room under a blanket of soft lights and second chances. I didn't think of them, not really. I didn't wonder whether they were hurt or alone or regretting what they'd done. Because justice, I had learned, doesn't always come with courtrooms or apologies. Sometimes it arrives in the form of silence, when the person they used to control finally stops answering. Sometimes it comes when they realize they can no longer manipulate the one they never thought would leave. And as the days turned into weeks and then months, they stopped calling. No letters, no emails, not even from Ryan. And in that void, I discovered something I had never been allowed to believe before. Peace is not earned through obedience. It's chosen through courage. They had tried to shame me, guilt me, use my children as leverage, and then frame themselves as victims. But in the end, they were simply cut off from the very thing they thought they owned, my time, my love, my loyalty. That was the justice, not vengeance, not public spectacle, but knowing they no longer had a hold on me. And in that freedom, I found something more powerful than retribution. I found myself again. Months passed, quietly and steadily, the way healing often does, not in grand gestures, but in the slow returning of peace, like waves smoothing the edges of a once sharp shore. It was a spring afternoon when I finally noticed how far I'd come, not because something spectacular happened, but because nothing did. I was sitting on our porch, a soft breeze teasing the edge of the newspaper in my lap, while Mia and Grant chased bubbles across the yard with the kind of unfiltered joy only children know how to sustain. Marcus brought me a glass of lemonade and sat beside me, not saying much. He didn't need to. There are silences that scream, and there are silences that heal. This one was the latter. I watched the sunlight catch in my daughter's hair and heard my son's laughter rise into the warm air. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something. I wasn't waiting for the next jab, the next guilt-laced voicemail, or the next attempt to pull me back into a family dynamic that had long stopped serving love. I simply sat in the moment and let it hold me. They hadn't reached out again, not a call, not a message, not even a third-party attempt through Ryan or mutual friends. And while there had been a time when that kind of silence would have gutted me, now it felt like space. Space I had earned, space I had built brick by quiet brick, boundary by boundary, truth by painful truth. Because the truth is, I had spent most of my life trying to prove I was good enough to be seen, to be heard, to be chosen. I had poured myself into people who only showed up when they needed something, mistaking obligation for love and silence for peace. And it wasn't until cancer stripped me down to my bones, until I faced mortality with nothing but grit and a hospital gown, that I began to question whether being needed was the same as being valued. It wasn't. Value isn't conditional. Love, when real, doesn't vanish the moment you draw a line. And healing, I learned, doesn't come when others change. It comes when you stop waiting for them to. There is no dramatic ending to this story. No courtroom speech. No family reunion bathed in redemption. Just a quiet house filled with laughter. A woman who finally chose herself, and 2 children who will grow up knowing that love doesn't require silence or sacrifice. It requires courage, consistency, and protection. And if you're someone who's been told you're too much, too loud, or too difficult, especially after all the years you've spent giving everything you had to others, then let this be your reminder. You do not have to shrink to be worthy. You do not have to buy your seat at the table. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is build your own table, invite the people who love you fully, and close the door on anyone who only knocked when they wanted something. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. And as for me, I no longer walk into rooms hoping to be tolerated. I walk in knowing I belong wherever I choose to show up. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever had to rebuild your worth after betrayal, I'd love to hear your story too. Subscribe for more real-life stories of quiet strength, second chances, and justice finally served. Because sometimes the best revenge is living in peace.